Washington cold case from 2003 was finally solved when an arrest shocked the entire community of McCleary. On March 24th, 17-year-old girl stepped into her driveway on a quiet spring night and vanished into headlights that cut through the darkness. Paul J. Beaker seized her, bound her, and forced her into the trunk of her own car before driving to a remote location where he assaulted her for hours. The DNA evidence sat sealed in an evidence bag for 18 years while the girl became a woman, carrying invisible scars through college, work, and sleepless nights. Detectives came and went, hope dimmed, the case turned cold. Then, in 2020, forensic genetic genealogy gave investigators a new weapon. Family trees converged on one name. A secret DNA collection confirmed the impossible match. The arrest in June 2021 sent shockwaves through Grays Harbor County, but when the truth emerged in court, would justice finally heal a community that had lived in fear for nearly 2 decades? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The spring air held promise on March 24, 2003. Cherry blossoms dotted the quiet streets of McCleary, and the 17-year-old girl stepped out of her family home with car keys jingling in her hand. The sun had set hours ago, leaving only the porch light and distant street lamps to push back the darkness. She walked across the familiar driveway toward her car, the same path she had taken hundreds of times before. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes. Her mind wandered to tomorrow's plans, weekend possibilities, the ordinary thoughts of a teenager in a small Washington town where nothing terrible ever happened. Headlights blazed suddenly from the street. A car door slammed. Heavy footsteps approached fast across the pavement. Before she could turn, before she could scream, strong hands grabbed her from behind. A voice commanded silence. Terror flooded her chest as zip ties bit into her wrists. Paul J. Beaker forced her toward the trunk of her own car. She tried to resist, tried to call out, but his grip was iron and his intentions clear. The keys she had been holding scattered across the driveway like fallen stars. In seconds, her normal life ended. The trunk slammed shut, trapping her in suffocating darkness. The car lurched into motion. She felt every turn, every bump in the road that carried her further from safety. Her mind raced through possibilities. Who was the stranger? What did he want? Would anyone notice she was missing? The darkness pressed against her like a living thing, and she struggled to control the panic rising in her throat. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She tried to memorize the sounds, the duration of each turn, anything that might help police find her later. If there was a later. The word "if" carved itself into her consciousness as the car finally slowed and stopped. The car door opened with a metallic groan, and cold night air rushed into the trunk. Paul J. Beaker's silhouette blocked out the stars. He pulled her from the vehicle with mechanical efficiency, his hands impersonal and cruel. She found herself in a remote wooded area, far from any lights or houses that might offer help. Pine trees towered overhead like silent witnesses. The ground beneath her feet was soft with fallen needles. He had chosen this place carefully, isolated, hidden, where no one would hear or see. Her torn clothing would later become evidence, fibers and DNA preserved in plastic bags, but in that moment they were simply the physical proof of violence. He said nothing during the assault. No words, no explanation, no human connection whatsoever. She stared at the stars through the canopy, trying to separate her mind from her body, trying to survive. The night sounds, owls calling, wind through branches, would haunt her dreams for years to come. Time lost meaning. Minutes or hours passed in a blur of terror and pain. She memorized his face in the moonlight, burned every detail into her memory. Dark hair, medium build, cold eyes that looked through her as if she weren't human. She would carry those features with her for 18 years before finally seeing them again across a courtroom. When it ended, he dragged her back to the car with the same mechanical precision. She went limp, conserving strength, planning. The return journey felt both eternal and too short. Each mile brought her closer to potential freedom, but also to the moment when he might decide she had seen too much. He drove in complete silence, his hands steady on the wheel, his expression blank. She watched his profile in the dashboard light, wondering what thoughts moved behind those empty eyes. There was no rage, no satisfaction, no emotion at all, just cold calculation that somehow felt more terrifying than fury would have been. The familiar shapes of her neighborhood finally appeared through the windshield. He was bringing her home. The realization brought both relief and confusion. Why let her live? Why let her go? She didn't question it, only prepared herself for whatever came next. The car slowed as they approached her street. Through the rear window, she could see the porch light still glowing at her family home, a beacon in the darkness that had never looked so precious. Paul J. Beaker pulled to the curb several houses away and turned off the engine. For a moment, they sat in silence. She could hear her own heartbeat, could smell the leather seats and air freshener that would forever remind her of this night. He opened his door and walked around to the trunk. When he opened it, she saw his face clearly for the final time. Expressionless, forgettable, the kind of face that blended into crowds. He cut the zip ties with a small knife and stepped back. "Go," he said. The single word was spoken without emotion, a simple command that ended her ordeal. She climbed out of the trunk on shaking legs, her body screaming from hours of confinement and worse. She ran. Her bare feet slapped against the cold pavement as she sprinted toward home, expecting at any moment to hear the car start behind her, to feel his hands grab her again. But the night remained quiet except for her own labored breathing and the distant sound of his engine starting. The porch light grew larger with each step. She stumbled up the front steps and pounded on the door, her voice cracking as she called for her parents. When the door swung open and she saw her father's face, the dam burst. All the terror and pain she had held back came pouring out in broken sobs. Her mother appeared in the hallway, confusion turning to horror as she took in her daughter's appearance. "Call 911, her father said, his voice steady despite the shock in his eyes. Now. She collapsed into their arms, finally safe but forever changed. The girl who had stepped into that driveway hours earlier was gone. In her place stood a survivor who would spend the next 18 years waiting for justice. Police sirens grew closer, their wailing cutting through the suburban quiet. Soon the house would fill with detectives and evidence technicians. Soon the long process of seeking justice would begin. But in that moment, wrapped in her parents' embrace, she simply tried to remember how to breathe. Dawn broke gray and cold over McCleary as police cars filled the quiet street. The lead cold case detective arrived with the first light, his practiced eyes taking in the scene with methodical precision. He had worked hundreds of cases, but something about this one, the randomness, the cruelty, the young victim, would stay with him for decades. Inside the house, the survivor sat wrapped in a blanket at the kitchen table, while a female detective interviewed her with gentle patience. Her parents hovered nearby, their faces etched with protective fury and helpless grief. The questions came slowly, carefully, designed to gather facts without re-traumatizing their daughter. "Can you describe his appearance?" the detective asked, her notebook ready. The survivor closed her eyes and brought his face into focus, the face that would haunt her dreams and drive her determination for justice. Medium height, dark hair, ordinary features that made him nearly invisible in a crowd. She provided every detail she could remember. Outside, crime scene technicians processed her car with scientific thoroughness. They photographed everything, collected fiber samples, dusted for fingerprints that they knew wouldn't match anyone in the system. Most importantly, they found traces of DNA on her clothing and the car's interior, biological evidence that would wait 18 years for technology to catch up with justice. The evidence bags were sealed and labeled with clinical precision. Evidence bag 1 contained clothing fibers. Evidence bag 2 held DNA samples. Evidence bag 3 preserved other trace evidence. Each bag represented hope for eventual answers, though none of them knew how long that hope would have to survive. Her parents signed forms and answered questions while their daughter gave her statement. The detective promised them that everything possible would be done to find the perpetrator. The CODIS database would be checked, tips would be followed, resources would be dedicated to solving this case. But even as he made these promises, the detective felt the familiar weight of uncertainty. Random attacks by strangers were among the hardest cases to solve. Without witnesses, without obvious suspects, without prior connections between victim and perpetrator, investigations often stalled quickly. The survivor finished her statement and was taken to the hospital for examination. More evidence was collected there, more forms signed, more promises made. By noon, she was home again, but home would never feel the same. The driveway where her keys still lay scattered would become a crime scene in her mind, a reminder of how quickly safety could vanish. The CODIS database search came back 3 days later, with the result every detective dreaded. No match found. The lead cold case detective stared at the computer screen, his hopes deflating like a punctured balloon. Somewhere in America, Paul J. Beaker's DNA profile existed only in evidence bags and laboratory databases, invisible to the system designed to identify repeat offenders. The news hit the survivor's family like a physical blow. They had held on to faith that modern forensic science would quickly identify their daughter's attacker. Instead, they faced the reality that he remained a ghost, unknown, unpunished, free to strike again. Fear spread through McCleary like ripples in a still pond. Parents began walking their teenagers to cars after dark. Women checked their locks twice before bed. The small-town sense of safety that had existed for generations crumbled overnight. If this could happen to a 17-year-old girl in her own driveway, it could happen to anyone. Local newspapers ran front-page stories about the attack, describing it in careful language that preserved the victim's privacy while warning the community. Radio stations broadcast safety reminders. The sheriff's office increased patrols through residential neighborhoods, but their presence only reinforced how vulnerable everyone felt. The survivor watched the fear spread from her bedroom window, where she had spent most of the days since the attack. She saw neighbors talking in hushed clusters on sidewalks. She watched parents clutch their children's hands a little tighter. The guilt was almost as crushing as the trauma. Her attack had stolen innocence from an entire community. Her father installed motion sensor lights around their property and changed all the locks. Her mother slept fitfully, waking at every sound. The family's routine revolved around her healing, but healing felt impossible while her attacker remained free. Every strange car on their street, every unfamiliar face at the grocery store could belong to him. School counselors were brought in to help students process their fears. The high school principal sent letters home to parents about safety protocols. Local churches organized prayer vigils for the victim's healing and the perpetrator's capture. McCleary was trying to heal, but the wound was still too fresh, the danger still too real. At night, lying in her childhood bedroom with new locks on the windows, the survivor stared at the ceiling and wondered if she would ever feel safe again. The DNA evidence gave her hope, but hope felt fragile against the enormity of an unknown enemy. 2 weeks after the attack, the detective's desk overflowed with tip sheets and witness reports. Every call was investigated, every lead followed, but they led nowhere meaningful. A suspicious man seen near the high school turned out to be a substitute teacher. A strange car in the neighborhood belonged to a visiting relative. The community's heightened awareness generated dozens of false alarms, but no real suspects. The detective compiled everything into a comprehensive case file, knowing that without new leads, the investigation would soon stall. He prepared a John Doe warrant, a legal document identifying the perpetrator by his DNA profile rather than his name. It was a placeholder for justice, a promise that even if they couldn't catch him now, they would be ready when technology or luck provided new opportunities. The warrant was signed on a gray April morning. Judge Sarah Martinez reviewed the evidence, read the victim impact statement, and authorized law enforcement to arrest the person whose DNA matched the samples collected at the crime scene. The document was filed away in legal archives, waiting for a name to replace the clinical designation Unknown Male 1. For the survivor, the warrant represented both hope and frustration. It proved that the system took her assault seriously, that her attacker would face justice if caught, but it also highlighted how powerless they all felt against an invisible enemy. The warrant was a promise written on paper, signed and sealed, but potentially meaningless without identification. Her parents treated the warrant like a small victory, a step toward eventual justice. They framed the detective's explanation letter and kept it on the mantel next to family photos. It reminded them that someone, somewhere, was working to find the man who had shattered their daughter's sense of safety. The detective kept his own copy in the active case file, pulling it out regularly to review the details. He had seen too many cases go cold to feel optimistic, but something about this victim's courage and her family's determination kept him invested. He promised himself that he would check this file regularly, looking for new opportunities to apply advancing forensic techniques. Spring turned towards summer and the initial urgency began to fade. The survivor's name disappeared from newspaper headlines. The extra police patrols were reduced. McCleary slowly returned to its normal rhythms. Though the undercurrent of fear remained, parents still walked teenagers to their cars. Women still checked their locks twice. But the case file remained active, the DNA evidence preserved, the John Doe warrant waiting for its day in court. By summer 2003, the community meetings had become a ritual of shared anxiety. Every Thursday evening, the McCleary High School gymnasium filled with neighbors seeking answers that no one could provide. The lead cold case detective attended each meeting, his presence both reassuring and a reminder of how little progress had been made. "We're following every lead," he told the assembled crowd, their faces etched with worry and frustration. "The DNA evidence gives us hope for eventual identification." But the words fell hollow against the weight of their collective fear. 3 months had passed since the attack, and Paul J. Beaker remained a phantom in their midst. Parents shared their concerns in voices tight with emotion. A mother worried about her daughter's summer job at the local ice cream shop. A father questioned whether his teenage son should continue his evening deliveries for the family restaurant. Every aspect of normal life had been touched by the fear of unknown danger. The survivor's mother attended one meeting, her first public appearance since the attack. She sat in the back row, listening as neighbors debated safety measures and shared theories about the perpetrator. Then the perpetrator, when asked to speak, she stood slowly and faced the crowd with quiet dignity. "My daughter is healing," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium, "but she won't truly heal until he's caught. None of us will." The room fell silent at her words. She sat down without saying more, but her message resonated through the community like a bell. After the meeting, neighbors lingered in the parking lot, forming small clusters around shared fears. They exchanged phone numbers and promised to watch out for each other's children. The community was drawing closer in response to the threat, but the unity came at the cost of innocence. The detective walked to his car through the dispersing crowd, their worried faces following him. He felt the weight of their expectations, their need for closure that he couldn't provide. At home, he spread the case files across his kitchen table and reviewed them again, searching for any detail he might have missed. The summer passed slowly, marked by vigils and prayers and the constant awareness that evil had touched their town and might still be hiding among them. The survivor began her senior year of high school in the fall, determined to reclaim some normalcy even as her attacker remained free. The autumn of 2003 brought the harsh reality that the case was growing cold. The detective's desk, once dominated by tip sheets and witness reports from the McCleary assault, gradually filled with newer crimes demanding immediate attention. The evidence bags sat sealed in the climate-controlled storage facility, preserved but no longer at the center of daily investigative work. The survivor returned to school with determined normalcy, though nothing felt normal anymore. She walked different hallways to avoid the windows that faced her neighborhood. She ate lunch in the library instead of the cafeteria, where conversations might turn to speculation about her case. Her school yearbook photo from that year would later become an artifact of resilience, a teenage girl's smile masking trauma that ran bone deep. Her classmates treated her with a mixture of sympathy and uncomfortable distance. They wanted to support her but didn't know how to approach someone who had survived something so terrible. She became a reminder of vulnerability, of how quickly safety could vanish, and teenagers naturally pulled back from such harsh truths. In the evenings, she focused on homework with laser intensity, using academic achievement as both distraction and proof that her attacker hadn't destroyed her future. Her parents watched her study at the kitchen table, amazed by her determination but heartbroken by the defensive walls she had built around herself. The detective continued checking the case file monthly, running the DNA profile through CODIS whenever new samples were added to the database. Each search returned the same result: no match found. Paul J. Beaker remained invisible to the system, his identity locked away in genetic code that technology couldn't yet decode. Local media moved on to other stories. The extra security measures became routine parts of daily life. The Thursday evening meetings dwindled as the initial crisis energy faded into resigned acceptance. McCleary was learning to live with the knowledge that evil had visited their town and might never be held accountable. But in the evidence storage facility, the sealed bags waited with infinite patience. DNA doesn't deteriorate when properly preserved. The biological proof of Paul J. Beaker's crime would survive decades if necessary, ready for the moment when science finally caught up with justice. The survivor carried that hope through her senior year, graduation, and the uncertain future beyond. The case was cold, but it was not forgotten. Years passed like pages turning in a book no one wanted to read. 2004 became 2005, then 2006, then 2009. The survivor graduated high school, attended college, found work, and slowly built a life around the scar tissue of trauma. The detective who had promised her family justice retired and was replaced by another, who was eventually replaced by another. Each transition brought new hope that fresh eyes might see something previous investigators had missed. The cold case file box bore the wear of regular handling. Different detectives opened it at different intervals, some quarterly, some annually, some only when similar crimes occurred elsewhere and might be connected. The DNA profile was run through CODIS regularly, but the database searches became routine rather than hopeful. Paul J. Beaker remained a ghost in the system. The survivor moved away from McCleary for college, then returned after graduation to be near family. Her parents had aged in the years since the attack, their faces carrying the weight of watching their daughter struggle with invisible wounds. They still hoped for justice, but had learned not to speak of it constantly. Hope deferred was hope that could become toxic if left unmanaged. The evidence storage facility expanded twice during these years, accommodating the accumulation of unsolved cases from across the county. The sealed bags from March 24, 2003, found themselves neighbors to evidence from dozens of other cold cases. Domestic violence murders, missing persons, armed robberies where the perpetrators had simply vanished into ordinary life. Forensic science advanced incrementally during this period. DNA analysis became more sophisticated, requiring smaller samples and producing more detailed profiles. But the technology wasn't yet advanced enough to extract useful information from distant relatives or trace family connections through public genealogy databases. That breakthrough still waited in the future. The survivor underwent therapy, learned coping mechanisms, and developed strategies for managing the hypervigilance that followed her everywhere. She learned to function at work and in relationships while carrying the constant awareness that her attacker was still free. Some days were better than others, some years were better than others, but the shadow never completely lifted. In quiet moments, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, she wondered if he had attacked others. Had there been victims before her? Victims since? The questions had no answers, which made them even more haunting. Her assault existed in isolation, a single documented crime that might represent only the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. The survivor survivor's college diploma arrived in May 2007, a symbol of determination that impressed everyone who understood what she had overcome. Her parents hung it in the living room next to her high school graduation photo, creating a small shrine to resilience and hope. She had chosen psychology as her major, driven by a desire to understand trauma and perhaps help other victims find healing. Her first job was with a nonprofit organization that provided counseling services to crime victims. The work was emotionally difficult but deeply meaningful. She met other survivors who carried similar invisible scars, and she learned that healing wasn't a destination but a daily choice. Some days she felt strong enough to guide others through their darkest moments. Other days she could barely manage her own emotional storms. Relationships remained challenging. Trust felt like a luxury she couldn't afford, even with people who proved themselves worthy over years of friendship. Dating was particularly fraught. How do you explain to someone new that their casual touch might trigger a flashback? How do you build intimacy while constantly watching for signs of potential danger? Her parents watched her navigate these challenges with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. They celebrated every milestone. First job, first apartment, first serious relationship. While privately grieving for the carefree young woman their daughter might have been, they had learned to find joy in her strength rather than mourning her lost innocence. The nightmares continued but became less frequent. Therapy helped her develop tools for managing the intrusive memories and anxiety attacks. She learned to recognize triggers and develop strategies for grounding herself when the past intruded on the present. Progress was measured in small victories. A week without flashbacks, a month of sleeping through the night, a relationship that lasted longer than fear could sustain. Through it all, she carried the hope that someday Paul J. Beaker would be caught. The hope was quieter now, less urgent than in the immediate aftermath of the assault, but it never disappeared entirely. Sometimes it flickered like a candle flame in wind, sometimes it burned steady and bright, but it always remained lit. She began speaking at victim advocacy events, sharing her story with groups of survivors and law enforcement professionals. Her voice was steady when she described that night in 2003, though her hands still trembled slightly. She had found purpose in her pain, transforming survival into service. By 2011, the original detective had been retired for 3 years, and the case had passed to the cold case unit, a specialized team that focused exclusively on unsolved crimes. The unit's whiteboard displayed dozens of case numbers and victim names, each representing someone's worst day and a family's ongoing pain. The McCleary assault from 2003 occupied space in the middle of the board, neither the oldest nor the newest, but persistently unsolved. Detective James Rodriguez joined the cold case unit that year, bringing fresh energy and a background in emerging forensic techniques. He was particularly interested in cases with strong DNA evidence, believing that advancing technology would eventually unlock mysteries that had stumped previous generations of investigators. The McCleary case caught his attention immediately. Rodriguez pulled the file and spent days reviewing every detail. He studied crime scene photos, read witness statements, and analyzed the DNA evidence with updated knowledge about genetic markers and population statistics. The evidence was solid. They knew exactly who had committed the crime. They just didn't know who that person was. He reached out to the survivor, now 26 years old and working as a victim advocate in Seattle. Their phone conversation was professional but emotional, with her expressing cautious hope that new attention might yield new results. She had learned not to expect breakthroughs, but she hadn't given up on the possibility of eventual justice. "I think about him every day," she told Rodriguez. "Not obsessively, but he's always there in the background of my thoughts. I wonder if he's attacked other women. I wonder if he has a family who doesn't know what he's capable of. I wonder if he ever thinks about what he did to me." Rodriguez promised to review the case thoroughly and explore new investigative options. Forensic genetic genealogy was beginning to emerge as a powerful tool for identifying suspects through family connections, though the techniques were still experimental and expensive. He began researching which cases might be good candidates for this new approach. The survivor returned to her work with renewed, cautious optimism. 8 years had passed since the assault, long enough for her to build a stable life, but not long enough to forget the man who had shattered her teenage sense of safety. She continued her advocacy work, speaking to groups about victim rights and the long journey of healing after violent crime. The breakthrough came in 2020, 17 years after the assault, when forensic genetic genealogy finally matured from experimental technique to practical investigative tool. Detective Rodriguez had been following the technology's development for years, watching as other cold cases across the country were solved through DNA analysis of distant family members. The McCleary case met all the criteria for genetic genealogy investigation: strong DNA evidence, evidence, no traditional leads, and a committed victim who wanted to pursue all available options. Rodriguez submitted the request to his supervisors, along with the survivor's written consent, to expand the investigation using new techniques. The genetic genealogy consent form she signed was a single page that represented 18 years of waiting. His signature, now confident and mature, authorized scientists to trace her attacker's family tree through public genealogy databases and genetic markers shared across generations. It was a document that earlier versions of herself couldn't have imagined. Technology that seemed like science fiction in 2003 had become investigative reality. Parabon Nanolabs accepted the case in early 2020, just as the COVID-19 pandemic was beginning to disrupt normal life. Their genetic genealogist, Dr. Sarah Chen, began the meticulous process of building family trees from DNA fragments, working backward through generations. To identify potential suspects, the work was painstakingly slow. Chen analyzed genetic markers, compared them to reference populations, and built family trees branch by branch. She worked with second cousins, third cousins, and even more distant relatives to trace bloodlines back to common ancestors. Each connection led to new possibilities and new branches to explore. Rodriguez checked in weekly for progress reports. The survivor, now 34 and married, tried not to think about the investigation too much. Hope had disappointed her too many times over the years. She focused on her work, her new marriage, and the fragile peace she had built around her trauma. But late at night, when her husband was asleep beside her, she sometimes allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to finally know her attacker's name, to see his face in a courtroom instead of her nightmares, to hear a judge pronounce him guilty and sentence him to prison. The fantasies felt dangerous. Too much hope could be crushing if it led nowhere. The family tree began to take shape in mid-2020, with genetic markers pointing toward families in the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Chen worked methodically through genealogy records, birth certificates, and marriage licenses, building connections across generations. The pattern slowly narrowed toward a specific family lineage in Grays Harbor County, the same area where the crime had been committed. By late summer, Chen had identified several potential suspects within the target family line. She provided Detective Rodriguez with a list of names, ages, and locations for men who fit the basic profile and had genetic markers consistent with the crime scene DNA. One name stood out immediately: Paul J. Beaker, age 39 in 2003, living in McCleary at the time of the assault. Rodriguez stared at the computer printout showing Beaker's driver's license photo from 2003. The face was ordinary, unremarkable, exactly as the survivor had described. Medium build, dark hair, features that could belong to thousands of men in the Pacific Northwest. But genetic science suggested this was the face that had haunted her nightmares for 17 years. The investigation shifted into high gear. Rodriguez researched Beaker's background, employment history, and current address. He was a mechanic who worked with his hands, lived quietly, kept to himself. No criminal record, no domestic violence reports, no history that would have flagged him as a potential suspect. He was exactly the kind of invisible predator that traditional detective work struggled to identify. Surveillance began carefully. Rodriguez needed to obtain a direct DNA sample from Beaker to confirm the match, but Washington state law required either consent or a warrant based on probable cause. The genetic genealogy evidence was strong but not yet legally sufficient for arrest. They needed proof that would satisfy both scientific standards and courtroom requirements. The survivor learned about the potential suspect identification through a carefully planned phone call from Rodriguez. She listened in stunned silence as he explained the genetic genealogy results and showed her Beaker's photo over video chat. After 17 years of wondering, she was finally looking at the man who had assaulted her. "That's him," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside her chest. "I remember his face." The confirmation was both relief and terror. Relief that he had been found, terror about what would happen next. The surveillance operation required careful planning and patient execution. Detective Rodriguez coordinated with other officers to monitor Paul J. Beaker's daily routines, looking for opportunities to collect discarded DNA samples without alerting him to the investigation. They followed him to work, to grocery stores, to gas stations, documenting his movements and waiting for the right moment. Beaker's routine was predictable and solitary. He worked at a small auto repair shop, ate lunch alone at a local diner, and returned home to a modest house where he lived by himself. He had few social connections and no apparent romantic relationships. His isolation had probably protected him from detection for 17 years. No one knew him well enough to suspect him of hidden crimes. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday morning in March 2021. Rodriguez followed Beaker to his usual coffee shop and watched him order a large black coffee coffee to go. The mechanic sat at a corner table, reading a newspaper while he drank, then threw his disposable cup in the trash and left for work. Rodriguez waited 10 minutes before approaching the trash bin. The coffee cup was buried under napkins and food wrappers, but Rodriguez retrieved it carefully using gloves and evidence bags. The rim showed clear traces of saliva where Beaker had drunk from it. After 18 years of waiting, they finally had a direct DNA sample that could be compared to the evidence from 2003. The cup was rushed to the state crime lab with highest priority marking. Rodriguez paced his office for 3 days waiting for results, while the survivor tried to focus on her work and her marriage, despite the emotional upheaval of knowing her attacker might finally be identified. Both of them had learned not to assume good outcomes, but the hope was harder to suppress this time. The lab technician called Rodriguez on a Friday afternoon with results that would change everything. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from the crime scene with statistical certainty exceeding 1 in a trillion. After 18 years, they had found Paul J. Beaker. Rodriguez immediately called the prosecutor's office to begin preparing arrest warrants. The evidence was overwhelming. Genetic genealogy had pointed them to the suspect, and direct DNA comparison had confirmed his identity with scientific certainty. There would be no more waiting, no more wondering. Justice had finally caught up with the mechanic who thought he had committed the perfect crime. The arrest took place on June 15, 2021 at 6:47 a.m. as Paul J. Bieker was leaving for work. Detective Rodriguez and 3 other officers surrounded his house with warrants for arrest and search. Beaker answered his front door in work clothes, coffee mug in hand, completely unprepared for the moment 18 years of investigation had been building toward. Paul J. Beaker, you're under arrest for the rape and kidnapping of a 17-year-old girl in McCleary on March 24, 2003. Rodriguez said, reading from the warrant. Beaker's face went white with shock, then settled into resignation. He offered no resistance as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The search of his house revealed a man who lived simply and kept few possessions. No trophies from the crime, no evidence of other victims, no journals or photographs that might provide insight into his motivations. He had hidden his crime by living in utterly ordinary life, blending invisibly into the community he had terrorized nearly 2 decades earlier. Rodriguez called a survivor with the news while Beaker was being processed at the county jail. She was at work when her phone rang, and she stepped into a private office to take the call that would finally close the circle of her long wait for justice. "We got him," Rodriguez said simply. "Paul J. Beaker is in custody. The DNA match is confirmed. After 18 years, we finally got him." She sat down heavily in the office chair, feeling 18 years of tension leave her body all at once. Tears came, not tears of joy exactly, but tears of completion. The question that had haunted her adult life finally had an answer. The face from her nightmares finally had a name. The invisible threat that had shadowed her family finally had substance. "What happens now?" she asked, though she knew the answer from her work with other victims. There would be a trial, testimony, cross-examination. She would have to face him in court and relive the worst night of her life for a jury of strangers. But this time would be different. This time, he would be the one sitting in handcuffs. The news broke that evening on local television stations. Cold case solved. McCleary man arrested for 2003 assault. The community that had lived with fear and questions for 18 years finally had answers, though the answers brought their own emotional complications. The news spread through McCleary like wildfire, carried by social media, local radio, and phone calls between neighbors who remembered the fear that had gripped their community 18 years earlier. Paul J. Beaker's name and photograph appeared on television screens throughout Grays Harbor County, transforming him from invisible threat to known enemy. Residents who had lived alongside Beaker for years struggled to reconcile the quiet mechanic they knew with the predator who had terrorized a teenage girl. He had attended community events, shopped at local stores, lived an apparently normal life while carrying the secret of his crime. The revelation shattered assumptions about recognizing dangerous people evil had hidden in plain sight for nearly 2 decades. The survivor watched the news coverage from her Seattle apartment, finally seeing her story told with a name attached to the perpetrator. For 18 years, news reports had described her assault in terms of an unknown attacker, a faceless threat. Now Paul J. Bieker's mugshot filled television screens, giving substance to the nightmare that had shaped her adult life. She met with prosecutor Linda Harrison the following week to begin preparing for trial. Harrison was a seasoned attorney who specialized in cold cases, and she approached the McCleary assault with methodical determination. The evidence was strong: DNA, victim identification, and a defendant with no credible alibi for the night in question. "This is going to be emotionally difficult," Harrison warned during their first meeting. "You'll have to testify about the assault in detail. The defense attorney will cross-examine you, probably trying to suggest that 18 years have affected your memory." But the DNA evidence makes this case very strong. We're going to get justice for you." The survivor nodded, her hands trembling slightly despite her outward calm. She had waited 18 years for this opportunity, and she was determined to see it through. Testifying would be traumatic, but staying silent while her attacker potentially went free would be worse. She had found her voice through years of advocacy work. Now she would use that voice to speak her truth in court. Beaker's defense team argued for bail, claiming he was not a flight risk and had no other criminal history. The judge denied bail, citing the severity of the charges and the 18 years Beaker had remained free. He would wait in jail for trial, finally experiencing the confinement his victim had endured in the trunk of her own car. The months between arrest and trial passed in a blur of legal preparation, media attention, and emotional turbulence. The survivor worked with prosecutor Linda Harrison to review evidence, prepare testimony, and understand the trial process. Each meeting brought both progress toward justice and renewed trauma as she relived the details of March 24, 2003. Beaker's defense attorney, Michael Torres, filed numerous pretrial motions challenging the DNA evidence, the genetic genealogy investigation, and the 18-year delay between crime and prosecution. He argued that the passage of time had compromised his client's ability to prepare an adequate defense and suggested that the victim's memory might have been affected by the long delay. Judge Patricia Williams presided over the pretrial hearings with efficiency and fairness. She ruled consistently in favor of admitting the DNA evidence, noting that genetic science had been properly validated and that the defendant's rights had been protected throughout the investigation. The genetic genealogy techniques were scientifically sound and legally permissible under Washington state law. The survivor continued her victim advocacy work during this period, though she took leave from speaking engagements to focus on the trial preparation. Her colleagues and clients supported her decision, understanding that this case represented not just personal justice, but validation for all survivors of violent crime who had been told their cases were unsolvable. Her husband provided steady emotional support throughout the pretrial period, accompanying her to meetings with the prosecutor and helping her manage the stress of media attention. The case had attracted regional and national coverage as an example of how advancing forensic science could solve decades-old crimes. He appreciated the public support but found the attention emotionally exhausting. Beaker remained in jail, reportedly reading extensively and maintaining his innocence to anyone who would listen. He had gained weight since his arrest, the stress of confinement and impending trial taking physical tolls. His few visitors were distant relatives, and his appointed attorney, he had built no close relationships that might have provided emotional support during his legal crisis. The trial date was set for July 15, 2022, almost exactly 19 years after the assault. The courthouse prepared for intense media coverage and community interest. After 2 decades of questions, McCleary would finally hear the full truth about the night that had shattered their sense of safety. Jury selection began on a hot July morning, with temperatures already climbing toward 90 degrees by 9 a.m. The courthouse air conditioning struggled against the combined heat of summer weather, packed galleries, and television cameras. Judge Patricia Williams questioned potential jurors about their ability to hear difficult testimony about sexual assault and their familiarity with the case through media coverage. Prosecutor Linda Harrison looked for jurors who could focus on scientific evidence while remaining empathetic to the victim's experience. She wanted people who understood that DNA evidence was reliable regardless of the time passage, and who wouldn't be swayed by arguments that 18 years had somehow compromised the case's validity. Defense attorney Michael Torres sought jurors who might question the reliability of decades-old memories or who harbored doubts about genetic genealogy techniques. He needed people who would demand absolute certainty before convicting his client, who would give weight to the presumption of innocence despite overwhelming scientific evidence. The survivor sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind the prosecutor's table, where she could see the jury selection process. This was her first time seeing Paul J. Beaker since that night in 2003, and the sight of him sitting calmly at the defense table triggered waves of anxiety and anger. He looked older, grayer, but essentially the same as the man who had destroyed her teenage sense of safety. 12 jurors and 4 alternates were selected by the end of the second day. They included teachers, nurses, retirees, and small business owners, a cross-section of the community that would decide whether justice would finally be served. The survivors studied their faces, wondering what they were thinking, hoping they would listen with open minds and closed hearts to the evidence about to be presented. Judge Williams scheduled opening statements for the following Monday, giving both sides the weekend to make final preparations. The prosecutor would present the case as a story of advancing science catching up with old crimes. The defense would argue reasonable doubt, challenging both the victim's memory and the DNA evidence that had taken 18 years to analyze. McCleary held its breath as the trial that would finally answer 2 decades of questions prepared to begin. Opening statements began at 9:30 a.m. on Monday, July 18, 2022, before a packed courtroom filled with community members, media representatives, and supporters of both the victim and the concept of justice delayed but not denied. Prosecutor Lyndon Harrison approached the jury with confidence confidence and clarity, her voice carrying easily through the silent courtroom. On March 24, 2003, a 17-year-old girl stepped out of her family home in McCleary to get into her car, Harrison began. She had no way of knowing that Paul J. Beaker was waiting in the darkness, ready to destroy her sense of safety forever. What happened next was a crime of opportunity that became a mystery of science, solved only when DNA technology finally caught up with an old evil. Harrison outlined the evidence methodically. The victim's immediate report to police, the DNA collected from her clothing and car, the 18 years of investigation that led to genetic genealogy, and ultimately to Beaker's identification. She prepared the jury for difficult testimony while emphasizing that scientific evidence would corroborate every aspect of the victim's account. Defense attorney Michael Torres presented a different narrative, focusing on reasonable doubt and the passage of time. Ladies and gentlemen, you're being asked to convict a man based on events that allegedly occurred nearly 20 years ago. Memories fade, evidence degrades, people make mistakes, even scientists and police officers. My client maintains his innocence, and the burden of proof remains on the prosecution to convince you beyond reasonable doubt. The survivor listened to both opening statements with careful attention, grateful for Harrison's clear presentation of the facts while bracing herself for Torres's inevitable attacks on her credibility and memory. She had prepared for this moment through therapy and legal preparation, but the reality of sitting in a courtroom while her assault was debated felt surreal and traumatic. Judge Williams called the first witness, and Harrison stood to present her case. Outside the courtroom windows, McCleary waited for answers that had been 2 decades in coming. Justice was finally at hand, but it would require courage from everyone involved. The victim, who would have to relive her worst night, the jury, who would have to weigh terrible evidence, and the community that would finally learn the truth about their long-hidden predator. The moment arrived on Tuesday afternoon when the prosecutor called the survivor to testify. She had been dreading and preparing for this moment for over a year, working with Harrison to review her testimony while managing the emotional toll of reliving trauma in preparation for public examination. She stood slowly, smoothed her professional dress, and walked to the witness stand with determined grace. Harrison guided her through the preliminary questions: her age at the time of the assault, her life in McCleary, her normal routine on the evening of March 24, 2003. The survivor's voice was steady but quiet, requiring her to speak directly into the microphone so the jury could hear every word. Her hands rested calmly in her lap despite the trembling she felt internally. "Can you tell the jury what happened when you stepped outside your house that evening?" Harrison asked gently. The courtroom fell into complete silence as the survivor began recounting the night that had defined her adult life. She described the spring air, the scattered car keys, the sudden appearance of headlights, and the man who destroyed her sense of safety. Her testimony was methodical and detailed, covering the abduction, the assault, and her eventual escape. She looked directly at the jury members as she spoke, occasionally glancing at Paul J. Beaker to confirm his identity. "That's him," she said clearly when Harrison asked if she could identify her attacker. "I remember his face, have remembered it every day for 19 years. Defense attorney Torres cross-examined her with professional courtesy but persistent questions about memory, time passage, and the reliability of identification after so many years. She answered each question directly, acknowledging the passage of time while maintaining absolute certainty about Beaker's identity and the details of her assault. Several jurors wiped away tears during her testimony, moved by her courage and the weight of trauma she had carried for nearly 2 decades. The courtroom gallery remained silent except for the soft sounds of weeping from community members who had waited almost as long as she had for this moment of truth. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, the survivor felt simultaneously drained and empowered. She had spoken her truth in the place where truth mattered most. Now 12 strangers would decide whether that truth would finally deliver justice. The prosecution's case continued with scientific witnesses who explained DNA evidence, genetic genealogy, and the laboratory procedures that had finally identified Paul J. Beaker after 18 years. Dr. Michael Chen from the State Crime Lab testified about the DNA profiles, using charts and graphs to show the jury how genetic markers from the crime scene matched samples from Beaker's discarded coffee cup. The probability that this DNA came from someone other than the defendant is less than 1 in 1 trillion, Dr. Chen explained to the jury. To put that in perspective, there are only about 8 billion people on Earth. The statistical certainty of this match exceeds any reasonable scientific doubt. Detective Rodriguez took the stand to describe the investigation, the genetic genealogy process, and the careful surveillance operation that had led to Beaker's identification and arrest. He explained how advancing forensic science had finally solved a case that had stymied traditional detective work for nearly 2 decades. The survivor watched from the gallery as witness after witness corroborated her account and strengthened the case against her attacker. Each testimony felt like another piece of validation, scientific proof that her memories were accurate and her suffering was real. The DNA evidence spoke with a clarity that transcended any doubt about time passage or memory reliability. Defense attorney Torres presented his case by challenging the scientific evidence and suggesting alternative explanations for the DNA evidence. He called his own expert witnesses to question the genetic genealogy techniques and argued that contamination or laboratory error might explain the DNA match. His case was thorough, but ultimately unconvincing against the weight of scientific evidence. Beaker himself chose not to testify, exercising his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. He sat quietly at the defense table throughout the trial, occasionally whispering to his attorney, but showing no visible emotion as witness after witness described his crime and its aftermath. His silence spoke volumes to jurors who might have been swayed by remorse or explanation. Closing arguments began on Friday afternoon, with Harrison summarizing the overwhelming evidence against Beaker and Torres, making one final plea for reasonable doubt. The jury listened attentively to both presentations, their faces reflecting the seriousness of their upcoming deliberation. Judge Williams instructed the jury on the law and sent them to begin deliberations. After waiting 19 years for answers, the community would wait a few more hours to learn whether justice would finally be served. The jury deliberated for 6 hours over 2 days, reviewing evidence and testimony with methodical care that reflected the gravity of their decision. They requested to re-examine the DNA evidence, the crime scene photographs, and portions of the victim's testimony. Their thoroughness suggested they understood the weight of convicting someone for crimes committed nearly 20 years earlier. The survivor waited at home during deliberations, unable to focus on work or normal activities while 12 strangers debated her truth. Her husband stayed close, providing support while trying to manage his own emotions about the case that had defined their relationship from its beginning. They had built their marriage around her trauma and healing. The verdict would affect both of their futures. Community members gathered in coffee shops and online forums to discuss the case, most expressing confidence that the DNA evidence was overwhelming, but some questioned whether the long delay between crime and prosecution was fair to the defendant, or whether memories could be trusted after so many years. McCleary was divided between hunger for justice and discomfort with the trial's emotional intensity. Paul J. Beaker waited in his jail cell, reportedly calm and resigned to whatever verdict the jury might deliver. His attorney had prepared him for the likelihood of conviction, given the strength of the scientific evidence. The genetic genealogy breakthrough had eliminated any realistic hope of acquittal. The best they could hope for was a hung jury or successful appeal. On Saturday afternoon, the jury foreman sent word that they had reached a verdict. Judge Williams scheduled the reading for Monday morning, giving all parties time to prepare for the moment that would finally close a case that had haunted the community for 19 years. The survivor spent the weekend in anxious preparation, knowing that Monday would bring either the justice she had sought for so long or the devastating disappointment of watching her attacker escape punishment once again. She had learned not to assume good outcomes, but the DNA evidence gave her reason for cautious optimism. McCleary held its collective breath as the final act of a 19-year drama prepared to unfold in Judge Williams's courtroom. Monday morning arrived, gray and humid, with early fog rolling off Puget Sound and settling over the courthouse like a shroud. By 8 a.m., a crowd had gathered outside the building. Community members, media representatives, victim advocates, and supporters who had followed the case through years of uncertainty and weeks of trial testimony. The survivor entered the courthouse flanked by her husband and parents, her face composed despite the emotional storm churning inside her chest. She had dressed carefully for this moment, choosing a professional outfit that projected strength and dignity. After 19 years of waiting, she would finally hear a jury pronounce judgment on the man who had assaulted her. Paul J. Beaker was led into the courtroom in shackles, his face pale but expressionless. He took his seat at the defense table and stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with the survivor or the packed gallery. His attorney whispered briefly in his ear, probably final instructions about maintaining composure regardless of the verdict. Judge Williams entered at 9:30 sharp, her black robes rustling in the silent courtroom. The jury filed in slowly, their faces grave with the weight of decision. None of them looked at Beaker or the victim, a sign that legal observers interpreted as likely conviction, though verdicts were never certain until spoken aloud. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Williams asked. The foreman, a retired teacher named Robert Martinez, stood and replied clearly, "We have, Your Honor." The court clerk accepted the folded paper and handed it to Judge Williams, who opened it and read silently before looking up at the packed courtroom. The survivor felt her heart hammering against her ribs as 19 years of waiting condensed into a single moment of truth. "The defendant will please stand," Judge Williams instructed. Beaker rose slowly, his attorney standing beside him. The courtroom held its breath as justice prepared to speak after nearly 2 decades of silence. The words that followed would either deliver the closure that had been so long delayed or extend the agony for another appeal cycle. In that moment between question and answer, the entire weight of the case balanced on a nice edge between justice and disappointment. In the matter of the state of Washington versus Paul J. Beaker, Judge Williams read in a clear voice that carried easily through the silent courtroom. On the charge of rape in the first degree, how does the jury find? Foreman Robert Martinez looked directly at Beaker as he replied, guilty. The word hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Several people in the gallery gasped audibly. The survivor felt her knees go weak with relief and vindication. After 19 years, a jury had finally validated her truth and pronounced judgment on her attacker. On the charge of kidnapping with deliberate cruelty, Judge Williams continued, how does the jury find? Guilty, Martinez repeated, his voice steady and certain. Beaker's head dropped slightly at the second guilty verdict, the weight of 2 decades of hidden crime finally settling on his shoulders. His attorney placed a supportive hand on his arm, but there was no comfort to be offered. The DNA evidence had spoken with scientific certainty, and 12 citizens had listened. The survivor burst into tears. Not tears of joy exactly, but tears of completion. Her parents embraced her from both sides while her husband rubbed her back gently. The emotional release of 19 years of tension was overwhelming, leaving her simultaneously drained and energized. Judge Williams thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following month. Beaker was led away in handcuffs, finally experiencing the confinement that his victim had endured in the trunk of her own car. He walked slowly, his shoulders slumped in defeat, no longer the invisible predator who had terrorized McCleary for nearly 2 decades. Outside the courthouse, Prosecutor Linda Harrison addressed the gathered media. Justice delayed is not justice denied, she said. Science and determination have finally held Paul Beaker accountable for his crimes. This verdict sends a message that we will never stop seeking justice for victims, regardless of how much time has passed. The survivor chose not to speak to reporters that day, overwhelmed by emotion and exhaustion. She would save her words for the sentencing hearing, where she would finally have the opportunity to address her attacker directly and tell him how his crime had shaped her life. For now, it was enough to know that he had been found guilty and would face the consequences of his actions. Sentencing day arrived 6 weeks later on a crisp autumn morning that reminded everyone of the March evening when the crime had been committed 19 years earlier. The courthouse filled again with community members, victim advocates, and media representatives eager to witness the final chapter of McCleary's longest-running criminal case. The survivor had spent weeks preparing her victim impact statement, working with a therapist to distill 19 years of trauma, healing, and growth into words that would convey the true costs of Paul J. Beaker's crime. She had written and rewritten the statement dozens of times, seeking the right balance between personal truth and public dignity. Judge Williams called the court to order and invited the survivor to address the court before pronouncing sentence. She walked to the podium on steady legs, her hands only slightly trembling as she unfolded the pages she had prepared. For the first time since the trial began, she looked directly at Beaker as she spoke. 19 years ago, you stole more than my sense of safety, she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. You stole my ability to trust, to sleep peacefully, to walk through the world without constantly looking over my shoulder. You turned my own driveway into a crime scene that I had to pass every time I came home. She described the years of therapy, the struggles with relationships, the nightmares and flashbacks that had shaped her adult life. But she also spoke about resilience, about the strength she had found in advocacy work, about the life she had built despite the trauma he had inflicted. I want you to know that you did not destroy me, she concluded. I survived your attack. I survived the years of waiting for justice, and I will survive whatever comes next. You took one night from me, but I have taken back all the rest. Beaker listened without expression, staring at the table in front of him. His attorney had advised him to remain silent during sentencing, knowing that nothing he might say could mitigate the severity of his crimes or the impact of his victim's powerful statement. Judge Williams thanked the survivor for her courage before turning to the business of sentencing. The guidelines called for 25 to 30 years for the combined charges of rape and kidnapping with deliberate cruelty. The prosecution had recommended the maximum sentence, given the severity of the crime and the defendant's 19 years of freedom. Judge Patricia Williams reviewed the sentencing guidelines one final time before addressing Paul J. Beaker directly. The courtroom remained completely silent as she prepared to close a case that had haunted Grays Harbor County for nearly 2 decades. Mr. Beaker, Judge Williams began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, you have been found guilty of rape in the first degree and kidnapping with deliberate cruelty. These are among the most serious crimes in our legal system, representing a violation of another human being that can never be fully repaired or compensated. She reviewed the evidence presented during trial, the impact of the crime on the victim and community, and the aggravating factors that supported a maximum sentence. The 19 years that Beaker had remained free while his victim struggled with trauma weighed heavily in the court's consideration. The court sentences you to 30 years in the Washington State Department of Corrections, Judge Williams announced. You will be eligible for parole after serving 85% of this sentence, contingent on participation in appropriate treatment programs and demonstrated acceptance of responsibility for your crimes. Beaker showed no visible reaction to the sentence, though his attorney leaned over to whisper in his ear. 30 years meant he would be nearly 70 years old before becoming eligible for parole, effectively a life sentence for a man who had already wasted the prime years of his adult life hiding his crime. The survivor felt a sense of completion wash over her as the sentence was pronounced. 30 years wouldn't erase the trauma of March 24, 2003, but it represented society's acknowledgement of the harm he had caused and its commitment to preventing him from harming others. Deputies approached the defense table to escort Beaker back to jail, where he would begin the long process of appealing his conviction while serving his sentence. As they led him away in handcuffs, he finally looked toward the gallery where his victim sat surrounded by family and supporters. Their eyes met briefly, victim and perpetrator acknowledging each other one final time before justice carried him away. Judge Williams banged her gavel, officially closing the case that had defined McCleary's relationship with crime and safety for 19 years. Court is adjourned, she said, and Paul J. Beaker disappeared through the defendant's door into the prison system, where he would spend the remainder of his productive life. The courthouse steps filled with people as the hearing concluded, creating a scene that mixed relief, vindication, and the strange emptiness that follows the end of long struggle. The survivor emerged, flanked by her family, prosecutor Linda Harrison, and Detective Rodriguez, who had worked the case for over a decade. Camera crews and reporters waited respectfully for her to speak. Today, justice was finally served, she said, reading from a prepared statement. It took 19 years, but Paul Beaker has been held accountable for his crimes. I want to thank the detectives who never gave up on this case, the prosecutor who fought for justice, and the jury who listened to difficult testimony with open hearts and minds. She thanked the genetic genealogist whose work had finally identified Beaker, calling it science in service of justice. She acknowledged her family's unwavering support and the therapy that had helped her heal while waiting for this day. Most importantly, she spoke to other victims of unsolved crimes, encouraging them to never give up hope that advancing technology and persistent investigation might someday bring them justice too. Detective Rodriguez spoke briefly about the importance of preserving evidence and continuing to investigate cold cases as technology advanced. This case proves that we never stop looking for answers, he said. Time may pass, but justice doesn't have an expiration date. The crowd gradually dispersed as the formal proceedings ended and normal life resumed. The survivor walked slowly down the courthouse steps with her husband, parents, and closest supporters. The weight of 19 years was lifting from her shoulders with each step away from the building where her truth had finally been heard and validated. McCleary could finally close the chapter on its most notorious crime. Parents could sleep a little easier knowing the predator who had stalked their streets was locked away. Children could grow up without the shadow of an unsolved crime hanging over their community. The fear that had lingered since 2003 was finally dissipating. But for the survivor, this wasn't really an ending. It was a beginning. The trial had forced her to relive her trauma publicly, but it had also demonstrated her strength and resilience. To herself and everyone who had followed her journey, she had faced her attacker in court and emerged victorious. Now she could focus on building the rest of her life without the weight of unanswered questions. 6 months later, the survivor stood in her childhood driveway for the first time since March 24, 2003. The same gravel crunched beneath her feet. The same porch light illuminated the path to the front door, but everything else had changed. Paul J. Bieker was in prison, where he would remain for the next 30 years. The questions that had haunted her family for 19 years had finally been answered. Her parents had aged during the long wait for justice, their faces bearing the weight of watching their daughters struggle with invisible wounds. But they had also grown stronger, their marriage deepened by shared purpose, and their love for their daughter refined by years of supporting her healing. They stood on the front porch, watching her reclaim the space where her nightmare had begun. The driveway belonged to her again, not just legally, but emotionally and spiritually. She had taken it back from the man who had stolen her sense of safety there so many years ago. The gravel still crunched the same way, but the sound no longer triggered memories of scattered car keys and approaching footsteps. It was just gravel again, just a driveway, just a place where a family lived in peace. McCleary had healed too, slowly and imperfectly, but meaningfully. The community that had lived in fear for 2 decades could finally relax its vigilance. Parents still watched their teenagers carefully and taught them about safety, but the sharp edge of terror had been dulled by justice served. The town's collective nightmare was over. The survivors' advocacy work had expanded following the trial as other victims of cold case crimes reached out for guidance and support. She had become a symbol of resilience and hope, proof that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied. Her story encouraged other survivors to never give up even when cases seemed hopeless. She walked back toward the house where her parents waited, ready to go inside for Sunday dinner and ordinary family conversation. The past would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her future. She had survived the attack, endured 19 years of waiting, testified at trial, and watched her attacker receive justice. The driveway where it all began was quiet in the fading sunlight, holding its secrets in silence, but no longer holding her captive to fear. She was free.